Hello, everyone. My name is Kay Gooch, and I'm Director of Community Programs here at ARC. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on AL amyloidosis clinical trials update. But before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to give you a brief overview on ARC. ARC is a patient-focused, patient-founded nonprofit organization whose mission is to advance science and both improve and extend the lives of those living with amyloidosis. We have 4 focus areas that you see here: improving the speed and accuracy of diagnosis, increasing our understanding of the disease to be able to identify new treatments, accelerate approval and reimbursement of the effective treatments, and then certainly enhancing the care and quality of life for people affected by amyloidosis. On our next slide, I'd just like to take this opportunity to really thank our very generous sponsors listed here for their support of this webinar series. We certainly appreciate your support, and we wouldn't be able to do it without you. And now on the next slide, we just have a few housekeeping details before we begin. Today's webinar is recorded, so we will post the webinar on our website, and you'll be able to view it. We'll send out an email about that along with the slides as well. You can submit your questions at any time via the Q&A box, and then we will try to answer those at the end. If you're having any trouble with your audio, you can also dial in from your phone, and that information would be in your registration email. And lastly, also, we'll send out a survey, so you'll get a survey at the end of the webinar. So please take a moment to fill that out. Your input is really very, very helpful to us in planning future webinars. Your input really does help. And on the next slide, I just wanted to remind everyone that we do have some 3 different booklets on AL amyloidosis. So you can find those on our website at archi.org, or you can also scan the QR code here to get it will take you to the page to order, and you can also call our patient support line if you'd like to get that information. So now I'd like to move forward with introducing today's speaker. She is certainly a familiar face on our ARC Talks on clinical trials. So joining us today is Kristen Hsu, who is our Executive Director of Research here at ARC. Kristen leads collaborative efforts to accelerate drug development in amyloidosis, including ARC's private-public partnership known as the Amyloidosis Forum. Her work focuses on advancing clinical trial design, developing meaningful endpoints, and ensuring that patient perspectives help shape the path forward for therapies in AL and other forms of amyloidosis. So now I will go ahead and turn it over to Kristen. Thanks for joining us, Kristen.
Thank you, Kay. Hi, everyone. My name is Kristen, and as Kay mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of Research here at ARC. Full disclosure, I am not a physician. My background is actually in clinical trials. So I started my career a long time ago working in clinical operations for a number of small to mid-sized biotechs spanning designing phase 1 through 3 clinical trials in large indications like Alzheimer's disease before moving into rare and ultra-rare clinical trials for different indications. And so I'm excited to be at an organization like ARC where I can take my knowledge of clinical trials and hopefully help patients through navigate clinical trials for themselves, and then also work to support the community to design trials that will be meaningful moving forward. So I'm excited today to share some of the updates that are happening for clinical trials in AL amyloidosis. I'll go over a little bit about what causes AL and the different treatment mechanisms that are being studied, but most of the discussions will be about the clinical trials themselves. If you are somebody who is newly diagnosed and just starting to learn about the disease, this might be a lot to take in. Start with some of the resources on our website, the disease booklets that Kay mentioned. I'll do my best to cover as much as I can, but some of the information we have available on the website will help supplement that. As Kay mentioned, we will make these slides available. You can take screenshots, but everything will be made available after so that you can discuss it, you can ask questions, you can discuss it with your doctor, your family members. We'll also post the webinar on our website, and I will repeat this every 6 months for AL amyloidosis as there are new developments to share. Before I get started, if anybody is on this webinar today to learn about TTR amyloidosis, this is going to focus entirely on AL today. So if you are looking for information on TTR amyloidosis, the last TTR webinar I did was in July. It's available either on our website if you go through the webinars, or you can also access it on YouTube. I will repeat the TTR clinical trial webinar in early 2026, probably the January timeframe with the most up-to-date information. So today I'm going to focus just on AL. Now, if you've joined these calls before, you'll know that I typically start by going over the basics of clinical trials, what they are, what the different phases are, what types of tests or procedures might be involved, and what kinds of risks and benefits may be involved. I've included all of that information on the next few slides, which we will make available, but I want to be really mindful of time, make sure we have time to get through some of the questions that people submit. And so for today, the most important piece for you to understand is that the studies that I'm going to cover today are going to focus on industry-sponsored interventional clinical trials of novel treatments. So trials that are designed to evaluate whether an investigative drug is safe or effective to patients. There are a lot of studies that are done by investigators. These are investigator-initiated trials. There are observational trials. I won't have time to go through all of those today. So today I'm going to focus just on those that are really focused on novel investigative therapies that are being developed by industry. Please feel free to ask questions about the phases, the different procedures, how to evaluate risk-benefit. I won't cover these slides, but they will be available. You can access them on our website after the call. Now, before we dive into specific clinical trials, I want to start by making sure that everyone understands just at a high level the different approaches that are being studied to treat AL amyloidosis. Starting with how the disease works. So this is covered in a lot of detail in our booklets, which you can download, get on the website. I'm just going to cover some of the basics to make sure that everyone can follow the slides when we talk about treatments themselves. Now, AL amyloidosis starts in the bone marrow, which is a specialized tissue in the hollow center of our bones where blood cells are produced. One of the blood cell types that everybody produces are called white blood cells or plasma cells. White blood cells produce immunoglobulins, which are also known as antibodies that target and neutralize bacteria and viruses. We all make antibodies, and they're always made of two kinds of protein chains, heavy chains or light chains. There are two types of light chains that are then broken down as referred to as either Lambda or Kappa light chains. So this is totally normal. Everybody does this. In AL amyloidosis, abnormal plasma cells actually produce an excess of light chains, so too many light chains, and it's usually always either the Lambda form or the Kappa form. These excess light chains then go on to misfold and form amyloid fibrils. While normal light chains are excreted through your kidneys, or so removed from the body by the kidneys, the abnormal or the misfolded proteins aren't excreted, which causes them to build up in the blood and form these fibrils. The fibrils then circulate in the bloodstream and deposit on different organs, which causes organ dysfunction and organ damage. In AL amyloidosis, this is most commonly the heart, the kidneys, sometimes the peripheral nerves, etc. And so how do you treat AL amyloidosis then? If AL happens, how do we treat it? So I'm going to liken treating AL amyloidosis to treating a clogged bathtub. So if you liken free light chain and amyloid fibril production to a faucet of water, and amyloid deposition to a clogged bathtub, if you follow this through, you can see we can start with an empty bathtub, which you would consider to be healthy organs. And over time, water fills up in that tub, similar to a faucet of free light chains, which then form amyloid fibrils that accumulate and deposit throughout the body. Now, to fix or treat that full bathtub, you could either turn down or turn off the faucet, which would slow down, stop the production of light chains. When the rate of free light chain production is slowed or stopped, amyloid buildup declines, stops entirely, hopefully, and organ function stabilizes. Now you'd have to actually drain the tub in order to remove all of the existing amyloid. And in an ideal scenario, you can imagine you'd be both turning off the faucet, so stopping the production of light chains, and then also draining the tub, removing all the amyloid that has accumulated. And so now let's go back to this slide. So if that's how we actually treat amyloidosis, how do we do this with the drugs that are being studied today? Many of the therapies that are currently being used or studied for AL amyloidosis aim to suppress or eliminate that abnormal plasma cell in the bone marrow and the free light chains that they produce. And so if your body's not producing these abnormal plasma cells, they can't go on to then produce those light chains that accumulate, form fibrils, and clog up your organs. These are known as anti-plasma cell therapies. A lot of these therapies are first studied and in many cases approved for the treatment of multiple myeloma, which is also targeting abnormal plasma cells. But in this case, the same mechanism of action that causes them to work in multiple myeloma also causes them to work in AL amyloidosis. It's getting rid of those plasma cells so they can't go on to produce the light chains. Now, there are a number of different types of anti-plasma cells directed therapies. The first category are known as your monoclonal antibodies. These are treatments that attach themselves to specific surface proteins on abnormal plasma cell clones, killing them and then allowing the immune system to identify and destroy them. And so I highlighted 4 different types of monoclonal antibodies: daratumumab, isatuximab, elotuzumab. So these all attach to different tags on the plasma cells and prompt the body either kill them directly or prompt the immune system to identify and destroy them. Daratumumab, so all of these are actually approved for the treatment in multiple myeloma. Today, daratumumab is the only monoclonal antibody and currently the only treatment that is approved for AL amyloidosis specifically. Isatuximab, elotuzumab are still investigational for AL. Anything that's going to be in red on this slide is investigational for AL amyloidosis. Belantamab mafodotin, is an antibody, but it's an antibody that targets BCMA, but it also has a payload. It's conjugated to a cytotoxic drug, or what would you consider a payload via a linker. So the antibody binds to BCMA, which is one of the targets on the plasma cell, and it actually delivers a cytotoxic payload, killing the cells directly. So it's an antibody, but it's got something extra attached to it designed to kill the cell ultimately. The next class of drugs are known as your BCL2 inhibitors. These work by stopping the growth of cancer cells by blocking BCL2, which is a protein that is needed for cancer cell survival. And so probably the most common BCL2 inhibitor that is being investigated for the treatment of AL amyloidosis is venetoclax, which is again approved in multiple myeloma. It's a pill that helps certain blood cancers by targeting BCL2. So again, this is something that allows abnormal plasma cells to survive. Many patients with AL amyloidosis have what's called a genetic feature called T1114, translocation 1114. This is something that is commonly present. It's on plasma cells and basically allows venetoclax to target patients who have this genetic factor. So because of that, venetoclax has been shown to be very promising. And then there are a number of different small studies of patients with AL amyloidosis who have T1114 in venetoclax. With that said, FDA has not yet approved venetoclax for amyloidosis because we still need larger trials to see how well it works in larger patient populations and how safe it is. There are a number of studies that are small and being done by individual research centers. There's a larger multi-center study that's being done by NCI, which I'll talk about later. But right now, venetoclax is primarily used as off-label treatment for AL amyloidosis. Now, the next class of drugs are known as your bispecifics or and newly a trispecific antibody. So these are antibodies that are composed of 2 different fragments, and they bind to 2 different types of cells at the same time. One attaches to the plasma cells that are responsible for making light chains, and ultimately helps to stop or slow down the production of the light chains. And the other part of it binds to your immune system, your fighter cells, known as your T cells, signaling them to attack and destroy the plasma cells that are making the faulty light chains. So again, it's attacking the light chains, but in 2 different ways, and in the trispecific case, 3 different ways. And then the last category of anti-plasma cell drugs are known as your cellular therapies, and in this case, CAR T specifically. So chimeric antigen receptor T cellular therapies. So this is a type of cell therapy in which a patient's T cells are changed in a laboratory so that they attack cancer cells. Doctors first collect patients' T cells from their blood. They modify the cells by giving them basically a GPS tracker that helps them find and attack cancer cells. And then they grow these T cells in large numbers and then infuse them back into a patient's body. And so it's a way of genetically modifying modifying your T cells so that it's actually hunting down and destroying the abnormal plasma cells in your body. So these are all on the left side here. You can see the drugs that are targeting your plasma cells. Once your plasma cells create these light chains, is there any way to treat the light chains themselves? And so there's a new molecule that is being developed that is essentially a light chain stabilizer. So something that is ideally going to, once your light chains are being produced in these excessive amounts, remember they misfold to form fibrils. But what if we can stop the light chains from misfolding and forming fibrils? And so that's what light chain stabilizers are designed to do. So it's a new treatment approach designed to prevent the abnormal folding of light chains, helping them keep their correct shape so that they don't misfold into toxic forms, that they don't start clumping together and forming amyloid deposits in your body. And so there's one light chain stabilizer in phase 1 studies right now, which we'll talk about in a little bit later. And then the last class of drugs, again, moving further down, once you've got these fibrils that are formed and they're attached to your organs, what can we do with them? And so there's a number of molecules that are designed known as antifibril agents. And so these are designed to attach to amyloid fibrils that have formed in the organs, deposited on your kidneys, on your heart, and they've been designed to either break the fibrils apart directly or mark them for removal by the immune system. And so there've been some unfortunate setbacks in clinical trials for antifibrils over the past 6 months. We'll talk about these in a little bit later. Right now, there is one antifibril agent that is currently still recruiting, AT02, which we'll talk about. Bertamimab ultimately has been discontinued, and then we're still waiting to see the full data for anselamimab, but I'll talk about that in a few slides. Okay, so that's how we treat it. Those are the different classes of drugs. I now want to focus on the trials that are recruiting for each of those different classes. And so this is a slide that we're going to come back to a couple times moving forward. You can see here on the left, I've got the different classes of therapies. So your monoclonal antibodies, the bispecific, the trispecifics, the cellular therapies, the BCL2 inhibitors, the light chain stabilizers, and the antifibril agents. And you can see each drug, what phase of study it's currently in. And then I'm going to highlight the studies that I'm going to talk about in the subsequent slides. So we're going to start by focusing on the industry-sponsored trials that are currently recruiting for patients, specifically these 5 trials that are outlined in red. So we're going to go over linvoseltamab, ETENTAMIG, NXC-201, AZD0120, and then AT02 first. All right, so let's start with the first one, and I'm going to go through these top to bottom. There's no other rhyme or reason in terms of like how far along they are. It's just simply the order that I have them noted on the slides. And so we're going to start with the LINKER-AL2 study, which is a 2-part study of linvoseltamab, a bispecific antibody in patients with relapsed refractory AL amyloidosis. And that's essentially patients who have AL amyloidosis that have been treated previously, and it's either returned or failed other therapies, and these patients need to be treated again. And so linvoseltamab, as I mentioned, it's a bispecific antibody. So that means it has 2 fragments, which bind to 2 different types of the plasma cell at the same time. In this case, linvoseltamab attaches to the BCMA antigen on plasma cells, responsible for making light chains, so that it's going to help to slow down or stop the production of light chains. And it also binds to the CD3 antigen on your T cells. So those are your immune fighter cells, signaling them to attack and destroy the plasma cells that make faulty light chains. This is a 2-part study. So in phase 1, linvoseltamab is going to be given to a small number of participants to study the side effects of the study drug and determine a dose to be used in the second part of the study. So the safest and most optimal dose to be used in phase 2. And then in phase 2, it's going to be given to a larger number of participants to continue to assess the side effects of the study drug and to evaluate the ability of linvoseltamab to treat AL amyloidosis. Now, in order to qualify for this study, patients have to have measurable disease. They need to have had at least one prior line of treatment, of therapy, and they need to have NT-proBNP levels, which are a cardiac biomarker, less than or equal to 8,500. And so that's typically in AL amyloidosis, your threshold for like advanced cardiac involvement. So it's keeping to patients who have levels lower than that. So I mentioned measurable disease. Patients need to have measurable disease, and what does that mean? Measurable disease in this case is determined as the difference between a patient's involved and uninvolved free light chains. And remember, I said light chains come as two types, Kappa or Lambda, and patients with AL amyloidosis overproduce one type of that light chain, and that's known as your involved light chain. And so in this case, measurable disease is going to be measured by the difference between your uninvolved and your involved light chain numbers. So it's going to be a lab test, a blood test that you'll take, and your physicians will be able to tell what the difference is between those two levels, and that will be used to determine whether you qualify for the study as having measurable disease. The study is anticipated to last about 3 years. And so all patients will receive study drug as part of this, and then it's enrolling in a number of different countries at the moment. So it's enrolling at about 18 centers globally, including the US, Spain, UK, and Korea. And then it's currently open at these cities, at these centers here. We've got City of Hope in Duarte, California, Colorado Blood Cancer, Carmanos in Detroit, the Ohio State University, MD Anderson, as well as SERI Oncology Partners in Texas. And so, again, if you're a relapsed refractory patient looking for a bispecific, this is a potential clinical trial option to look into. Moving on to the next study, this is another bispecific. This is a phase 1 study evaluating or phase 1b study, I should say, evaluating the safety and activity of ETENTAMIG, which is previously known as ABBV-383, in patients with relapsed refractory amyloidosis. Again, those whose AL amyloidosis has either returned or they've failed other treatments and need to be treated again. ETENTAMIG is another BCMA CD3 bispecific antibody, so it binds to BCMA on the plasma cells and CD3 on the T cells, trying to essentially attack that plasma cell in 2 different ways. This study will measure the highest safe and recommended dose of ETENTAMIG as a monotherapy, so with single therapy in patients, as well as some preliminary assessment of how it impacts patients. Again, it's broken into 2 different parts, a dose escalation and safety expansion phase, where patients will receive one of 5 different doses. And then they will, after they complete that dose escalation portion of the study, the safety expansion portion will begin, where patients will get one of either 2 arms, and they'll receive one of either 2 doses and continue on through the study. Now, in order to qualify for this study, patients need to have at least 1 prior therapy, which includes a proteasome inhibitor and an anti-CD38 antibody, like daratumumab, is probably the one that most patients would have received. And they need to have at least 1 organ involved. So they need their AL amyloidosis, the fibrils need to be causing dysfunction in either your heart, your kidneys, your peripheral nerves, at least 1 organ, your liver. And then in order to qualify for this study as having measurable disease, in this case, you need to have a difference between your involved and your uninvolved light chains of at least 50 milligrams per liter. And so you'll see each study has slightly different thresholds. This study requires at least a difference of 50 milligrams per liter. The study will enroll about 76 patients. Again, this is open label, which means every patient who enrolls in this study will receive ETENTAMIG. It's given as an infusion every 3 weeks an infusion every 4 weeks and will last for up to 2 years. And so you can see that it's enrolling patients across, 76 patients that will be enrolling across 21 sites across the US, Japan, Australia, France, and Greece. And I've highlighted here the locations, the 8 different centers that are recruiting in the US, from Florida, Massachusetts, Rochester, New York, Charlotte, Winston-Salem, Portland, Seattle, and Milwaukee. So again, that's ETENTAMIG for relapsed refractory AL amyloidosis, a bispecific. We're now going to move on to the first of 2 CAR T therapies that are recruiting for patients. And so NexaCAR2 is a phase 1b study of NXC201, which is the first CAR T therapy being studied in AL amyloidosis, and specifically in patients with relapsed refractory AL amyloidosis. And so I mentioned this earlier, but just a quick reminder, CAR T, or chimeric antigen receptor T, is a type of cellular therapy in which a patient's T cells are changed in a laboratory so that they will attack cancer cells. Doctors first collect T cells from a patient's blood. They modify the cells by giving them a GPS tracker that allows them to find and attack cancer cells. They grow these T cells in large numbers and then infuse them back into the patient's body. And so this is the first CAR T that's being studied in AL amyloidosis. It's a study that will recruit for a total of 40 patients who have been previously treated, with the goal of evaluating the safety of NXC201 in the first part of the study. And the study has actually now moved into the second portion of the study where the dose expansion phase, where they've selected a dose and are now recruiting for a broader number of patients. Everybody who participates in this study receives NXC201 as part of the study, and it's administered as a one-time infusion following leukapheresis and lymphodepletion. And so what are leukapheresis and lymphodepletion? Leukapheresis is a process in which the blood cells are collected from patients. Patients are connected to a machine. They collect the blood cells and separate them from the rest of the blood. They collect the white blood cells, separate from the rest of the blood. Those white cells are then shipped to a laboratory for processing, where the T cells are genetically modified. They're given that GPS tracker so that they can target plasma cells. In lymphodepletion, which is also called lymph depleting or preconditioning, patients receive a short course of chemotherapy to kill their T cells before the modified T cells. So get out all the old T cells, put those new modified T cells, the ones that have the GPS trackers, back into the patient, so that now those new T cells can go and find the plasma cells. And so it is a one-time infusion, but it does involve those 2 pieces beforehand: the leukapheresis, where your white blood cells are collected, separated, modified, and then reinfused back into the body. That process can take about 2 weeks. And so that's just an important piece to understand in terms of the overall time frame. The study will last about 2 years initially, with further long-term follow-up planned. And so I've listed the different centers here. It's currently recruiting at Sutter Health in Sacramento, Carmanos in Detroit, MSKCC in New York City, and Cleveland Clinic, along with 14 other locations here across the US. So again, these slides will be available. You'll be able to see all the centers that are recruiting and where they are. So now let's move on to the second CAR T study that is currently recruiting. This is a new study that just opened recently within the last month or 2, known as the ALACRITY study. So this is a phase 1b/2 study of AZD0120, which is a dual targeting CAR T therapy directed against both CD19 and BCMA in patients with relapsed refractory AL amyloidosis. And so this is going to be a similar design, looking to find an effective dose to then expand to a larger portion of patients. And so a similar design that you've kind of seen from the previous studies. It's going to recruit 91 patients who have been previously treated, with the goal of evaluating safety and tolerability of AZD0120. It will recruit for 91 patients. All patients will receive AZD0120 as part of the study following leukapheresis and lymphodepletion, same process as the NXC201. To qualify for this study, patients need to have had at least one prior line of an anti-plasma cell-directed therapy. They need to have one organ that's currently or previously been involved, measurable disease, measured as a difference between involved and uninvolved free light chains of at least 20 milligrams, or a serum M protein greater than 5. They need to be relatively active and healthy, and then they can't have any prior experience with CAR T or any prior BCMA targeting therapy, and then no prior treatment within the last 6 months with any bispecifics or trispecifics. And so that's just an important thing to think about when you're considering if you're a patient with relapsed refractory disease, do you want to go for a CAR T or a bispecific or a trispecific? And so it's just important to keep in mind that if you go for a CAR T, if you're interested in looking at CAR T, you most likely will not be able to do CAR T if you've had prior treatment with a bispecific or a trispecific. The reverse isn't necessarily the case. And so you could do CAR T, not do well on CAR T, and then still consider a bispecific, trispecific as a subsequent line of therapy if you need. So sequencing just becomes something to think about. Again, everybody will receive AZD0120. The CAR T therapy is part of this and will be in part of this study for at least 6 months. And so this study will enroll 91 patients across 3 different countries, US, Canada, and the UK. It's currently open in New York, but there are 8 other locations in the US that are planned. This study just opened recently. It oftentimes can take months to open trials. It's an extensive process that can take months, in some cases years, to open across all centers. And so there will be more centers opening for this trial, but New York is the first and foremost to get up and running in the US. All right, so the last trial to cover that is currently recruiting for AL amyloidosis patients is AT02, which is an antifibril depleter. And so this product was actually designed as a pan-amyloid depleter, so one that could theoretically attach to any type of amyloid fibril, whether that's AL amyloidosis, TTR amyloidosis, ALEC2, some of the rarer types. This study specifically is recruiting for patients who have AL amyloidosis with kidney disease. So it's a phase 2 study evaluating the safety and tolerability of AT02. So this antifibril depleter, so something that's going to attach to the fibril and remove it from the organs and hopefully restore organ function. This is a study that is essentially looking at the safety, so wanting to understand the incidence, frequency, and severity of adverse events, as well as the safety and tolerability through lab results. In order to qualify for this study, so patients need to have AL amyloidosis, and they have to have already received some type of plasma cell-directed therapy and have achieved a good partial response, achieved a very good partial response, VGPR, or a complete response. You can be on daratumumab maintenance therapy. You don't have to be, but that is something that is permissible in order to enroll for this study. You have to have had either VGPR or CR for at least 6 months in order to qualify, and you have to have some kidney involvement. And so either EGFR between 20 and 75, or ongoing protein in the urine that has not improved. And so, a urine protein to creatinine ratio that hasn't reduced by at least 25% in the past year or since you achieved your treatment response. Patients can have cardiac involvement, but they have to meet this kidney criteria in order to qualify. This is looking for a total of 12 patients who have AL amyloidosis with kidney involvement. It's given as an IV infusion once every 2 weeks for up to 6 months, so 24 weeks total. Everybody will receive study drug who takes part in this study moving forward. And so it is currently recruiting at 4 centers in the US, St. Luke's in Kansas City, Missouri, Cleveland Clinic in Ohio, OHSU in Portland, Oregon, and then UPenn in Philadelphia. Okay, so those are the studies that are recruiting for AL amyloidosis. There are also some studies that are planned to open in the next year for AL amyloidosis, and I want to highlight those as well. And so we'll start by looking first at teclistamab, which is a bispecific antibody that has a new study that is being sponsored by Stand Up to Cancer that was just announced, I think, earlier this week or late last week. RAMANTAMIG is a tri-specific antibody for AL amyloidosis that is currently recruiting in multiple myeloma, but has a small cohort planned for AL amyloidosis. And then PROT-001 is the first light chain stabilizer that is currently in phase 1 in Australia. It's recruiting for healthy volunteers. It's a first in human study, so it's actually being tested in healthy volunteers first. But they've got a phase 2, 3 planned in AL amyloidosis patients in 2026, assuming that the phase 1 data looks good. So let's talk about these. So teclistamab, as I mentioned, is a bispecific antibody. So it's going to target the plasma cells in 2 different places, BCMA and CD3. This is actually going to be a study that's in newly diagnosed AL amyloidosis. So every trial I've talked about so far has been in relapsed refractory or previously treated. This is the first study that will be planned for newly diagnosed patients. And so this is going to be a phase 2 study to assess the effectiveness and safety of teclistamab and daratumumab. So patients will receive both of these as part of this study, teclistamab and daratumumab in combination, to evaluate whether it's able to effectively decrease the level of free light chains, as well as long-term goals of avoiding organ damage, improving organ function, and prolonging life. And so this is going to enroll patients who are newly diagnosed, so no prior cell-directed therapy. They have to have measurable disease as defined by the difference in the free light chains of 50 milligrams per liter, or that serum and protein of greater than or equal to 5, and they need to have at least 1 organ involved. It's going to recruit 25 patients with centers at least initially planned in Boston and New York, likely additional centers. And will, as I mentioned, everybody will receive both teclistamab and daratumumab, which are both given as subcutaneous injections under the skin. And so patients will receive study drug for 6 months. And so this is given with teclistamab injections, step-up dosing for the first week. It then moves to weekly dosing through the end of the first month, and then monthly dosing through the end of the 6th month. And then daratumumab is given weekly for the first 2 months, and then bi-weekly or every 2 weeks through month 6. And again, everybody will receive study drug as part of this. And so if you're a newly diagnosed patient and interested in a bispecific, this is a good study to keep an eye on and to look for. The second study that I'm going to highlight, so this is a study of RAMANTAMIG, which is a tri-specific antibody. So a tri-specific antibody is a next generation immunotherapy that can bind, if bispecifics are binding to 2 spots on a plasma cell, tri-specifics are binding to 3 spots on the plasma cell simultaneously. So it's designed to recruit immune cells, target plasma cells, as well as enhance immune activation. And so the goal of this is to really enhance the potency, reduce the rate of relapse and likelihood of relapse, and generate more and robust immune responses. And so this is a phase 1 study that is currently recruiting for multiple myeloma patients, but there is a arm planned, a small number of patients that are planned for who would have AL amyloidosis. And so for the patients this will open in AL amyloidosis patients hopefully in 2026. It will recruit for patients who are previously treated, so have to have had at least 3 cycles of 1 line of therapy for a total of at least 2 cycles, or 2 or more lines of therapy for AL amyloidosis. Patients need to have measurable hematologic disease with a DFLC greater than or equal to 50, at least 1 organ involved, and they have to have reduced left ventricular ejection fraction. It will enroll 180 patients total, again, mostly multiple myeloma, but there will be a small group of AL. And RAMANTAMIG is given as a subcutaneous injection under the skin. And so the study itself will take or participants will be part of the study for about 2 years, a little bit less than 2.5 years. And so it's going to recruit across 9 centers in the US, as well as centers in Belgium, France, Japan, Netherlands, Spain, and the UK. And so the last study, I don't have a slide for this one just because we don't know what the study will look like yet, but the last one I do want to highlight is this PROT-001 study that's planned. So PROT-001 is a light chain stabilizer. So again, it's designed to keep the light chains from misfolding and forming fibrils and depositing in the body. And so this molecule is currently in phase 1, first in human studies in the US. So it's actually currently being tested in healthy volunteers, healthy individuals. And there are plans to initiate a phase 2, potentially phase 3 study, or phase 2/3 study in 2026. And so that would be a much larger study. It would involve centers across the world. And so this is something to keep an eye on. We don't know yet whether this will be studied in newly diagnosed patients or in relapsed refractory, but it's certainly a different treatment approach from what has been available or studied to date in AL amyloidosis. So something to keep your eye on. Very quickly, because it's a lot of different studies and different disease status that we covered, I just wanted to quickly summarize for patients. So the only study that's going to be recruiting for newly diagnosed patients is that TECLISTAMAB daratumumab study, which will be starting soon. Most of the studies that are currently recruiting are recruiting in relapsed refractory or previously treated. So for the bispecifics, trispecifics, that's linvoseltamab, ETENTAMIG, RAMANTAMIG. For CAR-T, both the NXT201 and the AZD0120. And then for an antifibril, it's the AT02, specifically for patients who have renal AL with kidney involvement. And then we still don't know yet what PROT-001, the light chain stabilizer, will be tested in, but that should be something that is shared over the next few months. All right. Last thing I wanted to highlight is just want to take a moment to talk about some of the news, the results that have come out of the antifibril agents in AL amyloidosis since the last time we kind of got together in April of 2026. Unfortunately, there was a lot of I was very excited to see the results of or was looking forward to, I guess, the results for the large phase 3 antifibril molecules that were being studied. So bertamimab, which was developed by Prothena, unfortunately failed to meet its primary endpoint in Mayo stage 4 patients. And so Prothena has discontinued development of bertamimab. It did not show an ability to improve time to mortality in that phase 3 study across the overall patient population. So it has been discontinued. Separately, Alexion had 2 phase 3 studies of anselamimab, formerly known as KALE-101, and neither study met its primary endpoint, which was in overall populations Mayo Stage 3A or Mayo Stage 3B to reduce survival and cardiovascular hospitalization rates. We know it didn't meet its primary endpoint in the overall patient population. What we do know is that it did show highly clinically meaningful improvement versus placebo in survival and cardiovascular hospitalizations in a pre-specified patient subgroup. I do not know what subgroup that is. The data is still being reviewed, is still being analyzed. We still need to understand what that pre-specified patient subgroup was, and understand what pathway there might be moving forward for anselamimab. So still more to come. I wish I could say more. We still have to see the data and have to see the results. But it is encouraging to see that there was an effect seen in a small pre-specified group. We just need to find out what that group was and understand a little bit more moving forward. And so that's something, again, to keep an eye on, whether there might be a regulatory path forward, whether there might be additional studies forward, or whether the product itself could be discontinued. We don't know. And so something to keep an eye on. Okay, so that was a lot. I covered a lot of trials. There are a lot more that are currently recruiting or planned across the space that I won't be able to go over today, but I did want to highlight some that are currently ongoing that are investigator-sponsored single-center trials or imaging trials. Venetoclax, as I mentioned, I kind of separated these out by the different drugs. And so we've got two studies that are currently recruiting for venetoclax, which is, again, it's a BCL2 inhibitor. It's a drug that's designed to stop the growth of cancer cells by blocking BCL2, which is a protein needed for cancer cells. And so patients, it's currently recruiting for patients with specific genetic changes called translocation factor T1114, which I mentioned earlier. Probably up to 50% of patients with AL amyloidosis have this T1114 translocation factor, and it's relevant for venetoclax treatment because it results in the overexpression of BCL2. Venetoclax specifically targets BCL2. So if you're overproducing BCL2, if you have this translocation factor, you're most likely to benefit from treatment with venetoclax. And so we've got two studies that are ongoing. This first one is currently the first one, this phase 1 trial, this is an NCI trial that's multi-center across 15 different locations. It's not recruiting today, but it will be, it's just because it's in between phases. And so they've completed the initial part of the study looking for, to identify a dose, and they'll be opening the dose expansion phase within the next few weeks, I would imagine. And so they are expecting to complete enrollment in early 2026. So if you're a patient with relapsed refractory, AL amyloidosis, if you know that you're T1114 positive, this is a good study to consider if you need additional treatment. Likewise, the next one that's looking just at a different combination, venetoclax and dexamethasone in patients with relapsed refractory AL amyloidosis. There are also a number of different investigator-led trials looking at different treatment regimens for daratumumab, which is the only drug that's currently approved today, as well as studies for belantamab mafodotin and elrantamab. So this is an antibody antidrug conjugate as well as a monoclonal antibody. Lastly, I've got two imaging trials noted here that are looking to validate PET radio tracers. So one is looking to evaluate florbetapen for the diagnosis of cardiac AL amyloidosis, and one that is looking at evuzametide to elucidate, to diagnose patients who have AL or TTR amyloidosis. And so if you're a patient who is still in the process of getting diagnosed, these would be, if you have suspected cardiac amyloidosis, these would be good studies to consider getting involved in. I believe both are nearing the end of their recruitment periods, but are still open today on clinicaltrials.gov. All right, before we end, before we move to questions, I should say, now that we've kind of covered all of those clinical trials, like how do you participate in one? If you want to participate in a clinical trial or even just stay informed, what are the best ways to do that? And so there are a few different ways. Clinicaltrials.gov is probably the first one that I will start with, just because that's where all information ultimately is going to come from. It's publicly available. It's a federally mandated national database of clinical trials. And so a lot of the information that I pulled today comes directly from clinicaltrials.gov. I will say it can be challenging to search for studies on clinicaltrials.gov. Even when I search for amyloidosis trials, I get a lot that pull up for Alzheimer's and other different types of amyloid-related disorders. And so if you struggle to find what you're looking for on clinicaltrials.gov, you're not the only one. So with that said, I've included some other options. Always talk to your healthcare provider about clinical trials that you might be eligible for. Make sure you're asking them. Make sure that if you're interested in a trial, you're bringing it to them, working with them to determine whether you might be a good candidate or not. Connecting with groups like ARC or Amyloidosis Support Group, ASG, is another great way to stay informed of clinical trials that are recruiting, and also stay informed of the results of ongoing trials. We always try to share results as they're made available for like the larger phase 3 studies, news about drugs being submitted, approved, discontinued. And so connecting with patient organizations is a great way to, or country-specific groups if you're outside of the US, is a really great way to stay informed. And then the last one I'll highlight is My Amyloidosis Pathfinder. And so My Amyloidosis Pathfinder, or MAP for short, is an online tool that ARC created to help patients with amyloidosis get connected to treatment centers, as well as clinical trials specific to their type of amyloidosis and symptoms. And so you can access MAP. We'll drop a link in the chat. Once I stop talking, I can drop in. It's myamyloidosispathfinder.org, but we'll drop a link in the chat. Anybody can sign up and create a profile. It's free to use. You can check it out for yourself, if you're a patient. You can also sign up as a caregiver or a family member of somebody who might be interested in participating in clinical trials or learning more. You'll be asked a few short questions about what type of amyloidosis, whether you have prior treatment experience, what organs are involved. And then once you create that profile, you'll be able to first and foremost find and compare different treatment centers if you're looking if your first and foremost concern is finding a center to be treated at. But then you'll also be matched to clinical trials that you might qualify for based off of your type of amyloidosis. And so you'll see instantly which ones are currently recruiting that you might be good matches for. And as new trials are opening up, we'll send you notifications letting you know that there's a new trial that's opened. Based off of your profile, you might be a good candidate for it. And so you'll be able to log in, learn more about the trial, see which centers are recruiting, and use that information to really make the decision for what's best for you and whether or not it's something that you're interested in pursuing. So it's a great way to stay informed and get involved in trials, which ultimately helps advance research towards better treatment and a cure for amyloidosis. And so I think that's my last slide. And so I'll stop sharing for now, but hopefully that was digestible.
Yeah. Thank you, Kristen, so much. I'm always amazed every webinar that you can get through this information. So we certainly appreciate it. I just had a couple of questions. Someone was asking about, I think you mentioned this, but do all trials involve cardiac involvement? If I have renal involvement, would there be a trial for me? And I think you had mentioned one, but if you could just...
Yeah, so most trials will require at least one organ be involved, and the majority of patients with AL amyloidosis who have organ involvement usually have heart involvement, or renal involvement, kidney involvement, or both. And so they don't all require heart involvement, but they do require at least one organ to be involved. And that ATO2 study specifically is a good one to consider if you have renal involvement. So that one specifically is looking for patients who have kidney involvement, measured by either creatinine clearance or proteinuria, so your protein in the urine.
Okay, great. And I do also want to mention, I know there are a couple of people that were asking about recording. So it's a lot of information. We understand that. But if you want to, we'll have it recorded. We'll have it available on the website so you can listen to it multiple times, and the slides will be there as well. So another question was, do any of these trials differentiate between light chains?
So there are no trials. So I think what the question is asking whether the trials are looking for specifically Kappa involvement or Lambda involvement. And to my knowledge, none of these trials are looking for one or the other specifically. If you have relapsed refractory, they're going to want to see a difference in the levels between involved or uninvolved, but there aren't any trials that I know of, at least the ones that I covered today, that are looking for predominantly Kappa or predominantly Lambda involvement.
Okay, great. Someone else asked about, you were talking about primary endpoints. And can you kind of elaborate that on how they're decided, and if a drug fails on one primary endpoint, has it ever turned around and had a different primary endpoint to study again? I know that's a lot.
Yeah. So when researchers are designing clinical trials, one of the things that they have to do is decide what endpoints they're going to use to measure whether a study drug is doing what they think it should be doing. And so, and those endpoints are given a hierarchy. And so that's where you'll hear your primary endpoint, your secondary endpoint, your exploratory endpoints. And so when something is designated as a primary endpoint, it's like you're picking if this one measure, if we show that the drug is having an effect based off of this one measure, typically that's something that that's gonna be the deciding factor as to whether or not the drug works in simplistic terms. With that said, you might have secondary endpoints that are less important, but like that primary endpoint would be what gets on a label. And so if you think about like drug labels, like you'll see that, you know, a drug is designed to reduce the risk of death or reduce the risk of hospitalizations. That would be designated as like your primary endpoint. There are absolutely cases where studies in phase 3, so drugs who go through phase 3 might miss on their primary endpoint, but actually show an effect on some of their secondary endpoints and get approved. It's
Okay.
not common. And to pull like an example from amyloidosis, in the TTR amyloidosis space, for example, tafamidis was actually first developed for um, hereditary TTR amyloidosis patients with polyneuropathy. And when it completed its phase 3 study back in 2000, in like the early 2000s, 2010, around that, it actually failed to meet its primary endpoint. It went on to get approved by 41 other countries globally for the treatment of TTR, hereditary TTR patients with polyneuropathy. It wasn't approved in the US. It didn't meet that endpoint. And regulators will look at different levels of evidence to decide whether or not something is really having the intended effect it is, whether the benefit outweighs the risk. And so different regulatory authorities might evaluate that differently. And that was the case with tafamidis. So it's not unheard of for a drug to fail to meet a primary endpoint, but still get approved in different areas. But I wouldn't say it's common, and so possible, but there's a lot that goes into that. And ultimately, we need to see the data. And so I don't know if this question came up because of anselamimab, but it's encouraging to know there was an effect, but we still haven't seen the data, and just that's something that remains to be seen by the broader community.
It's a complicated thing,
Yeah.
so to think about. Someone did ask, they said they assume that clinical trials for AL are different for ATTR, like there wouldn't be a clinical trial that would ever just be for both. So
Yeah, there actually was. There isn't anymore. So ATO2, as I mentioned, it was designed as a pan-amyloid depleter, so something that would theoretically attach to any type of amyloid fibril and remove it. And so that the initial ATO2 study actually was designed for TTR amyloidosis and AL amyloidosis and patients with rare types. Right now, it's only recruiting for patients with AL and kidney involvement, but there could be trials in the future that recruit for both. Right now, it's all kind of either one or the other.
Okay, great. And someone else was asking how, like, if you're looking at the investigational clinical trials now, like the things that are coming out are available now, how are they really different from current available drugs in the AL space?
Yeah, so right now, the only drug that is approved for AL is daratumumab. So it's a monoclonal antibody that's targeting CD38, so one marker on your plasma cells to prompt your body to stop making those, to kill those plasma cells so that it's not creating additional light chains that are clogging up the bathtub and your organs. So the other products that are being studied, so the biospecifics are targeting the plasma cells in two different places. So one, they're prompting your body to kill or it's targeting one marker on the plasma cells, and then it's also targeting your T cells, your fighter cells, to again try to clear those plasma cells. So the biospecifics, trispecifics are targeting it in 3 different places instead of the one. Cellular therapies are designed, again, to kind of genetically modify your white blood cells to go after and target the plasma cells. And so a lot of them are really ultimately still designed to attack the plasma cells, but just do it in slightly different ways. And then PROT001 is the light chain stabilizer. That's going to work to try to stop the light chains from misfolding and forming fibrils. And then ATO2 is the antifibril depleter. So that's going to try to remove the fibrils that are actually stuck and clogged on your organs. So it's going to try to empty the bathtub. So a lot of them are still directed at that plasma cell. It's just doing it in more ways than the one that daratumumab is currently doing, and in slightly different ways.
Okay, great. Just one other question. I know we're at the top of the hour, and this one may be a little bit more in depth, but what are some of the biggest challenges that researchers are facing in developing new treatments for AL?
Yeah, it's a good question. So one, it's a small patient population. Like I mentioned, all of these drugs, for the most part, all of the therapies I talked about, with the exception of AT02 and PROT001, the light chain stabilizer, they're all developed for multiple myeloma first. And so multiple myeloma is a much larger indication. It's got a very clear regulatory pathway and endpoints. And so one of the biggest challenges, honestly, is from a company standpoint, I think getting the priority and building the case to expand the labels for these drugs to look at AL amyloidosis. And so clinical trials are not cheap. They're incredibly expensive. It's incredibly risky. It requires a lot of funding, capital, and resources to push forward. And so I think a lot of cases, just making the case and advocating that companies be not focused just on multiple myeloma, but also that they consider doing additional development programs in AL amyloidosis is a big hurdle. And so there are a lot of really dedicated people internally that try to do that within each of these companies. But it is a business case, which is challenging.
Yeah.
Separately, endpoints are really challenging. So AL amyloidosis is a very complex disease. One of the experts always says to physicians, if you have seen one AL amyloidosis patient, you have seen one AL amyloidosis patient. They all look very different. Patients have different level of organ function. They are at different levels of organ involvement. And so trying to design a trial with one set of endpoints for patients who might have very different organ involvement, look very differently, will progress very differently, or at different stages of their disease is incredibly challenging. And so if you think about that anselamimab study that failed to meet its primary endpoint, it could be that the patient population was just so heterogeneous, everybody had different levels of organ involvement, that you're only able to see an effect. But we have one set of endpoints, and to be able to see an effect on that endpoint across all patients when they all look very different is challenging. So trial design, endpoint selection is a huge challenge. And so those are probably, I would say, the two biggest pieces in terms of drug development challenges.
Good. Thank you again, Kristen. We appreciate your taking the time to educate us on all the AL amyloidosis clinical trials, and we look forward to more in the future and good things. Just a reminder again that you will be receiving an evaluation a survey that will pop up after. And also remember to go check out my amyloidosis Pathfinder to look at clinical trials as well, or reach out to our patient support email box if you have questions, or give us a call. So we hope you all have a great afternoon, and thanks again, Kristen.
Thank you.
Bye.